This week on the Wake and Bake podcast.
Well, where to start? I think it started in Tibet about 1,500 years ago, but that's another story. Cannabis I think of as an energy medicine. It works on the mind, body, spirit level simultaneously, but it has to include the somatic, the body level.
You're already anxious, you're already paranoid, you're already these things, and it's just bringing it to the top so that you can navigate that, so that you can move through it.
Reports of people saying, my God, I've never known cannabis could do that.
There's a lot of talk about what to do if you've taken too much and you're feeling these things. And none of them are sit with your thoughts, let the thought rise.
Banish the ego, beat it over the head or whatever. That's why it's, in my view, an advanced or powerful spiritual ally in that way.
Quakers, you can infiltrate that. You can do Presbyterian. There's a beautiful Presbyterian church.
The optimal dose is the dosage that you both want to and can handle.
The problem with most drugs is that people don't do enough of them and they do them too often.
Because it actually wants to take you into reality, believe it or not. There's a great potential that's untapped in almost all human beings.
Welcome to the Wake and Bake podcast. My name is Corinne Tobias, and unfortunately, my co-host, Andrew Maharg, is out sick this week. Not to worry, we have a brand new spanking episode for you that came out of last night's book club about cannabis and spirituality. This is a book, if you're watching this on video on YouTube, I'm holding it up right now. It's Cannabis and Spirituality, an explorer's guide to an ancient plant spirit ally. It's an incredible book, a compilation of many different authors, many different practitioners coming together to discuss cannabis and spirituality. What was really cool about last night's book club is that it wasn't just a discussion between all of us who had read the book. We actually had the author and editor, Stephen Gray, on to talk about cannabis and spirituality. We also covered how to hold space for people in cannabis ceremony and in guided cannabis meditation. So if you're a practitioner or if you're a health and wellness professional in some way, this is going to be really potent stuff for you. He actually has a chapter in his book about how to create cannabis ceremonies. And we would love to see this work expand and for as many people to be out there introducing people to the plant in this way as possible. So go ahead and check out that book and tune in to what he says about that about midway through the conversation. We also talk about some basics and some ways to navigate cannabis and meditation, ways to think about cannabis meditation, how to prepare yourself for those kinds of things. We hope you love this conversation. It was so much fun to have. And we just started getting so many messages in the inbox this morning like, hey, can I get the replay? Can I get the replay? That we decided to release it as a podcast. I hope you love it so much that you want to share it with somebody else. Please do. We couldn't exist without you. So please share this podcast. We love hearing from you. So also email us at support@wakeandbake.co. And that's it. Let's get started.
Welcome to our December book club, our last book club of the year, and something that we have been eagerly awaiting here at CCI, actually since April. So yeah, we've been waiting for this and been really excited for this for a long time. So thank you everyone for joining. We have the editor, author of Cannabis and Spirituality with us here today, Stephen Gray. So that's wonderful. Okay, before we dive all the way in, let's talk about who this book club is sponsored by.
Yes, this book club, our final book club of book club season, is brought to you by the Cannabis Coaching Institute. We are currently enrolling for the Certified Cannabis Educator Program, a newly internationally accredited program. We are very excited about that. It's a 12-week program that gives you everything you need to get paid to teach others about cannabis. You can do that in a variety of different ways, workshops, by doing podcasts, blog posts, by doing nerdy stuff like book club, all good ways to spread the word and get paid doing it. So if you've always been thinking about joining us again, now is the time. We've heard that a lot. We had a lot of new students join us in November. So it should be a really fun cohort to join along with. So yeah, if you have any questions about the program, just let me know. You can pop it in the chat or send them to support@cannabiscoachinginstitute.com.
That's awesome.
It is awesome.
And let's introduce ourselves. So I'm Andrea Maharg. I am a certified cannabis coach and educator living in awesome Ontario, Canada. Although the BC, Canada people are always trying to get me to move out there. And I have been teaching about this plant for 5 years, and it's a joy every day to do this kind of work and be able to meet with other awesome, nerdy people like you on a Monday night and chat about it. And you, Corinne?
I'm Corinne Tobias. I'm the founder of Wake and Bake and the Cannabis Coaching Institute. I've been doing this work we're going on year 11 now. It started out with sharing healthy cannabis recipes with folks and then evolved into a weed nerd kind of career. I'm so excited for this particular book club. And if you've been with us for most of book club this season, you know that we've been tackling some like huge topics, right? We've been talking about social justice and equity. We've been talking about the nerdy side of cannabis and how is it medicine. And today we're going to cover something that we've never covered and that you just really don't see necessarily a lot covered, especially by the academic community or the educator community. And that is this topic of cannabis and spirituality. I'm so excited that we're here doing this today. So thank you all for being here.
Okay. Let's introduce the main event of the show. Stephen, we are so excited to have you here. Can you introduce yourself and tell us why, like, how did this book come about, please?
Oh, well, where to start? I think it started in Tibet about 1,500 years ago, but that's another story. Anyway, I'm from the generation where psychedelics, including cannabis, first really exploded onto the scene in the Western world, in North America and Western Europe in particular. So I've been interested in cannabis since I was about 18, which is around when it first appeared, actually. I mean, now it's like as soon as you can, smell it, you can find it anywhere, right? But at that time, it was just coming on board in the very late, or near the end of the 1960s and so on. And I was just really interested in it. I just, basically, growing up in white Anglo-Saxon Protestant Ontario, Canada, in the late 1950s and through the 1960s, anything was more interesting than that. So I was very interested in all that. And I was also so there was one thing, I'll try to be as brief as possible about this. There was a kind of a phenomenon, you might say, a cultural phenomenon that happened that kind of got up my way near the end of the 1960s and was quite influential in the early part of the 1970s. And that was a kind of commingling or dovetailing of interest in spiritual issues, particularly of the East, like of Asia, like Hinduism, Buddhism, and so on, with an explosion of interest in psychedelics. And I was interested in all of that, both of it. So not everyone, and it's still the case today, I'm sure, that is interested in taking a psychedelic is interested in their spiritual use. Some people might just be interested in for the thrill or whatever. But I was always interested in that aspect of it. And so that just became a theme in my life. There was another thing going on around for the people that had explored psychedelics and found them to be quite revelatory. Perhaps you had an experience of the divine or whatever. So then this idea went around, which was, you've had these revelatory experiences, but what are you going to do now? You have to ground that into your daily life. So for many people, it became a spiritual practice. And for me, that was Tibetan Buddhism. But I was always interested. I actually left off smoking cannabis for about 10 years because nobody around me in the Buddhist community was. But then I got reinterested in psychedelics in the late 1980s through the work of Terence McKenna, who brought those two themes back together, ancient spiritual use of psychedelics. I kind of got more interested in the spiritual use of cannabis that way as well.
You just mentioned
Sure.
Terence McKenna, and one of my questions is about something that he said once that kind of rattles around in my mind when I'm thinking about cannabis and spirituality. And one of the things that I believe it was him who said it, but basically that in a nutshell, it was like the problem with most drugs is that people don't do enough of them and they do them too often, right? And so he was more of a proponent for higher doses. I remember listening to him talk about how microdosing, you're just going to end up being weird and ostracized from your community, right? He didn't think that was the way to go about it. He really believed that you should be in a setting where you should be taking doses that would reveal you to yourself or to some kind of higher truth. And I'm curious that, because you just mentioned him, what you think about that in terms of cannabis. Do you think that if someone's just starting out with cannabis, if they're not a medical cannabis user and using it daily, is it best to have the experience and go all the way and be in a guided setting? Or is it best to ease in and take, use some cannabis meditation, some of the practices outlined in your book?
Yeah, that's an interesting and kind of big question, to be honest. First of all, clearly not everyone is going to see cannabis use the way I do. If you want to use it for spiritual use, you said something, that Terence had said was, higher dose but less frequent, right? More or less, yeah. I think that's important. If that is your intention with cannabis, I have no judgment about people using it for numerous other purposes, of course. If you want to explore, the spiritual dimensions of it, the spiritual opening, you might say, might be a slightly more descriptive term, potential of cannabis. I think it's best if you leave it alone from my personal experience, at least 3 days, and preferably longer. Start treating it like you would cannabis is a psychedelic when you use it that way. And Terrence said that too. Cannabis has nearly all of the same effects as other psychedelics when used appropriately in a sufficient dosage. So frequency, I think, is really important. Give it some space because, as you guys probably know, the endocannabinoid system gets satiated. The technical term is downregulation, right? So the endocannabinoid receptors get full, to use a layperson's way of describing it, and it takes them some time to clear out. It doesn't clear out right away. So from my point of view, to use it to go deeper, it's important or valuable to give it some space. Okay. So then, as far as dosage, that's a kind of a complex one, and I wouldn't say I have an answer that's carved in stone or anything like that. But my standard kind of answer about that one is, again, we're talking about use for spiritual use, is the optimal dose is the dosage that you both want to and can handle. Okay, so want to is, do you want to just do a little bit? Because if you just do a little bit, some people might call it a microdose. I don't know. I don't even use that term for cannabis myself, like one toke or whatever. But a light high might be a way that I would describe that. It can help with meditation. If you can calm the mind, it can help you, relax and calm it. And then if you're going to meditate, then it can be good for that. But then if you want to go deeper, if you want to go into the deeper end of the pool, you want to have more. And so the can handle part is, how much can you stay calm, open-hearted, present, not completely, obsessed or compulsively thinking constantly. A basic core central Buddhist teaching is that, while of course we need our thinking mind as a tool, the tricky part of all that is that the thinking mind is also the ego's primary strategy for obscuring the awakened state. So we tend to think compulsively, or like overlapping thinking, and that creates a kind of a ink cloud or fog cloud or veil between us and what many traditions would call the awakened state, whatever language they use, right? So I think it's really important to recognize that you can go deep with cannabis, and it can really open things up. Many psychedelics are referred to as non-specific or unspecific amplifiers, and cannabis, can be considered in that way as well, that it opens things up, it enhances, it deepens, empowers, but then it's a tool, so the stronger the dose, the more of a powerful tool it is that way, and the more challenging it becomes, because it actually wants to take you into reality, believe it or not. I don't know how the folks watching this feel that way about it. One guy's laughing there, so he likes it, I guess. I want to say that a lot of people don't like cannabis. You guys know this, I'm sure. They don't like it because they don't like what goes on in their thinking mind, right? They don't like where it takes their thinking mind. They get paranoid or self-sabotaging thinking or whatever, right? So this is where I'm saying the can handle part is like, what is the dosage at which you can stay present for? You can pay attention to your breath without obsessing over it, of course. You can stay centered in your seat or whatever, and open your heart, open your mind, and let it take you into a deeper space. Okay, I could say way more, but let me stop there in case you have another question you want to ask.
I do actually have a follow-up question on that. Because you mentioned that the paranoia, and that's why people don't like it. And we do hear that a lot: anxiety, paranoia, these feeling
Yeah.
states that people don't want to have. And I remember when I was very early on in all of this, talking to people about cannabis and spirituality, and I heard many people say, well, those things that you're feeling you would already be feeling that way. That's your, okay. I was curious if
Yeah.
that's
No,
your perspective on that as well.
exactly. No, completely. I think of cannabis potentially, it's not always going to be that way, of course, as a reality medicine. It actually wants you to see what's true, what's going on. And so the paranoia, some people may disagree with me, fine. I'm not going to make any dogmatic statements about this, but my view of paranoia with cannabis is basically just what you said, Corinne, is that we carry around these fears, but in our sort of quote unquote sober state, most of us are able to keep them at bay and focus on other things, right? So cannabis potentially brings those to the surface. And that's why it's, in my view, an advanced or powerful spiritual ally in that way, because it actually wants to soften the ego. It actually wants to help you dissolve the ego and just be present that way. But that's scary for all of us, and again, I could go on about this a long time because it's basic Buddhist teaching, but the simplest way I can put it for the moment is that the ego, and this is not like a judgmental thing about the ego, and banish the ego, beat it over the head or whatever. The ego, from a psychological Buddhist type perspective or definition, is the voice in our head, so to speak, that by which we have created our version of reality. But it's all up here. It's all beliefs. It's all concepts. It's the things we've shipped on from our culture and our parents and so on. So we create this kind of little package of what we think is reality, but it's not. It's a story, or it's a collection of stories, right? But we're very attached to it with good reason. Anyone who has coped with life, more or less, coped with it pretty much because we created a package, so to speak, that was functional enough to cope with, right? However, at a certain point, you begin to realize that it's limiting, you know? It's just what you've believed about what's real and unreal and true and not true and safe and unsafe and possible and not possible, et cetera, et cetera. But it's extremely limiting, as people who are like the great mystics would remind us. There's a great potential that's untapped in almost all human beings. So where cannabis comes in with that, and why, again, it can be scary and induce paranoia, is because it's threatening that package, that ego, right? And so you have to be able to let it go. And this is basic meditation, basic universal meditation teaching, is that, let's say you're sitting down to meditate, you just watch the thoughts that arise and don't judge them. That's the key, right? No praise, no blame is what they used to say, when we did our sit down practice. Don't praise doesn't matter what it is, whether you think you're the greatest person in the world, or you just came up with the greatest idea in the world, or you think you're, the lowest. You just sit with it, you just watch the thoughts and let them go, and you realize you are not the thoughts. And where cannabis comes in is it can clarify and enhance and amplify and deepen that process. But again, that's why it's potentially a powerful ally and also a scary ally.
I love that so much. And I know we have a lot of cannabis educators and people who are doing this professionally on the call. And there's a lot of talk about what to do if you've taken too much and you're feeling these things. And none of them are sit with your thoughts, let the thought rise. Is that what you would say to someone who, even if it wasn't using as a spiritual tool, would you say this works even if you're out and about and you're like, well, this is too much? Maybe you should let the thoughts rise and go and feel your feelings until they shift, and that kind of do you think that would be helpful for people?
Great question, actually. And again, I don't have a stone tablet over here where I've carved in the answer to that. But it depends on how much, overdone you are, so to speak. And it also depends on whether you've inhaled it or taken it orally. Because if you've taken it orally, it can be quite a bit stronger and it can last for a really long time. So it's not easy to come, quote, down, so to speak. But there's a point in there, I think, especially if you've inhaled it, where you're pushing your edge. The reason, okay, so as I understand it anyway, when you've had more than you can handle, remember I said a little while ago, the optimal dose is the dose that you both want to and can handle, right? So if you've had more than you can stay relaxed and comfortable and open and not completely driven by constant thinking with, then that's because it's pushed you to your edge of where you're willing to let go, willing to surrender. Okay. So you basically have two choices. You can try to mitigate it, and there are different things that people say you can do. Some people say you can eat an orange, you can have a cold shower, whatever. Eating a bunch of food can help bring you down, et cetera, et cetera. Or you can stay with it. Like I've led a lot of cannabis ceremonies. That's one of the things that I do, right? And occasionally that's what happens to somebody. They had a little too much, but then I just say, okay, stay with it. Like in a couple of cases, they had to lie down for 10 minutes. But I say, when you go and lie down, don't buy into the thoughts, whatever comes up, like, oh no, this is horrible or whatever, right? Just a thought comes up, try to stay with the breath, try to keep relaxing, and it will ease, over a little bit of time. So I've had a few people that, very few, but a few people that went a little too far, more than they could handle. A couple of people just had to lie down for a few minutes, keep breathing, and 10 minutes later they were back up and back in the circle, So I think it's very possible to work with that energy, even when it feels somewhat too much. So I think, Corinne, you said something about, kind of easing in, and that can be a good way to go. Like if you're new to cannabis, or if you haven't explored the deeper realms in that way, partly because you just haven't, or because, again, your endocannabinoid system is completely satiated because you smoke 2 or 3 times every day, and then you're never going to go to those places. I don't think. Some people could correct me on that, but that's my experience. I think it's always smart to start, as they say, what they say, start low and go slow. I've had people in my circles that don't use cannabis a lot, and they've had one largest toke of this kind of stuff, and it was too much for them, right? So we had to work with them. They had to work with themselves. We had to work with them a little bit like that. So yeah, I kind of leave that one there for now. But that was I think an excellent and important question, actually. How much and what to do about it if you feel like you have had too much. I'm guessing that a lot of people that have that experience, they're not doing it in a disciplined way particularly. In other words, they're not sitting in a ceremonial circle, or they're not sitting alone at home meditating or whatever, right? They're doing it in other kinds of circumstances. And that paranoia factor, for example, can be exacerbated around other people because, you feel vulnerable, Uh, yeah, you can feel very vulnerable. I had one time where I had eaten something, so it was quite strong, and I was at a party, and this was when I was in my early 20s. Wasn't quite as wise and mature as I am now, but I was at a party, and I couldn't do anything. I couldn't say anything because I realized that I had a public persona, and the people that at that party only knew my public persona, and I couldn't call it up. So I was sitting forlornly in a chair at the side of this gathering, and a friend came over and sat beside me, noticed I was looking not too good, and said, "What's going on?" I said, "Well, I can't find myself," or whatever. I don't remember what I said to her exactly, and she said, "I like you better this way." In other words, you're not, you haven't put on your role suit to meet the public, right? Um, so that's where that vulnerability comes in. But if you're in a circle, if you're meditating or whatever, you can watch those kind of thoughts come up and not buy into them. Ideally, that's the aspiration. That's the potential.
Thanks so much for sharing that. I was thinking about your cannabis and how you're leading spirituality gatherings, and about the kind of role and responsibility that you would take as a leader in that space. And it leads to my next question about what you think the role of cannabis in churches, for example, is. We have a few cannabis churches up here in Canada. It is gathering momentum kind of globally to infuse cannabis into spirituality in this way. Can you talk about what you see as the future of cannabis, like in more organized religions, and what the discourse is on it out there? Like, what are people saying about cannabis in church,
Mm.
etc.?
There's one chapter in particular, oh God, I've forgotten his name now, Stephen Hager. He was the editor of High Times magazine for much of its heyday. He talks in his short chapter about a kind of a church, informal sort of a church they have, and they have certain kinds of protocols and rules, and it's very egalitarian. It's really important that if it be non-dogmatic, what one of my favorite people calls heterarchical rather than hierarchical, meaning everybody is in a sense equal that way. Um, Leadership and authority should come naturally rather than somebody appointing or being appointed, even for that matter. Indigenous people often historically understood this quite well, that they would follow a leader if the person made sense to them, but they had no trouble abandoning that leader if they felt like the person was getting off the rails or too egotistical or self-important. So it's got to be like that. I think it can't be focused around a charismatic leader. I mean, I think that's kind of the message of cannabis, is that it's egalitarian, it's inclusive that way. It's non-exclusive, and it's the people's plant, as we like to say, or the people's psychedelic even. So I don't know exactly what they're doing in churches. There's one of the contributors to Cannabis and Spirituality who was there's two of them actually, one in Hawaii and another one was part of a Rasta type church in southern Florida and Jamaica and so on. And they had different ways than the way I would do something like that. If it were me, first of all, the actual churches these days they're not doing that well in terms of attendance, are they? Their congregation is aging. They're not getting a lot of young blood in there. I'd like to see, I mean, it's going to take a few more years of dissolving stigma for it to get to this point, but there's so much potential they have they got the great buildings, right? They got these beautiful buildings. What I'd love to see is people gathered in a building like that. We had at our conference, Spirit Plant Medicine Conference in Vancouver, the last 4 years, we've had a cannabis ceremony on the Saturday evening, right in the middle of the conference, where we've been gifted pre-rolls, and 200 people stayed for the Saturday evening. We set it up as just like I would do if I had a circle of 10 people, right? And then we had these pre-rolls, gave them to them, asked them to go outside in silence, outside of the university building we were in, smoke in silence, come back in silence, and then we spent an hour and a half or so either doing silent sitting meditation or guided meditation or some visualizations and some sound journeying with crystal bowls and things like that. So that's the kind of ceremony or not sermon, but ceremony I would like to see for cannabis. And you could do that in a church. You could have a beautiful choir as well. You could do it a little bit like the Santo Daime people do with ayahuasca, where they have hymns that they sing, and then they have sections of 45 minutes to an hour of silence. They call it concentration. You're just meditating, right? So it could be a mix of silent meditation, other kinds of sounds, choir, either a choir at the front or everybody singing like they do in a lot of churches or whatever. I think there's immense potential. The two of the authors in the book referred to cannabis as the sacrament of peace, the universal sacrament of peace. It's because it's so sort of user-friendly that way.
I love that. I'm just like thinking, I'm like, oh yeah, like Quakers, that'd be a great, that'd be a great, you can infiltrate that. You could do Presbyterian. There's a beautiful Presbyterian church that I would love to have that happen. And no, I was just thinking about how cool that would be. I mean, like you said, there is an interesting thing that has happened, at least with cannabis, where governments have gone, oh, well, this can make us money. I mean, when you're talking about religion and numbers declining and people not wanting to be interfacing with organized religion, like maybe they'll start seeing the same thing, as you said, when the stigma moves on. But I do kind of want to
let me just say, can I just add one more thing to that theme before you go on? Yeah, thanks. So the picture that's coming to my mind when we talk about this is, we're at a turning point on the planet for a lot of reasons. I think there's immense potential for the religion of the future, if you want to use that word, to be experiential, not necessarily listening to like sermons or whatever, but actually going deep in our own experience. I think that's been what's missing to a large degree from much institutional religion, is the teachings may be there, although that's another issue. They may be questionable too, but there's still great teachings that are coming from different religions. But it's the experiential component. And meditation, of course, like just simple follow the breath, can be very valuable that way. And cannabis can add to that because of this non-specific amplifying capability. So I think there's immense potential there.
I love that. There are two questions actually in the chat that
Oh.
dovetail both of these. And the first one is from Shannon. She said, I'm a certified cannabis meditation facilitator and a cannabis educator. She said, Stephen, I'm curious what you recommend as best practices for engaging in cannabis ceremonies, both as participants and facilitators.
When I do them, I have two, and again, there's no stone tablet sitting off to my right here. In fact, the chapter that I wrote in the book, Cannabis and Spirituality, on that, I think it's called something like a open source flexible template for ceremonies. So it's just a suggestion, and I have two different kinds. I have the inhale only ones, and those are usually an evening. And in those ones, we meet around 7 or whatever, sit in a circle on meditation cushions. I generally ask people to, a lot of people are not used to sitting in a meditation posture. They want to lean back or they want to slouch. But I'm a big supporter or believer in the idea of sitting straight so that your spine is aligned, your acupuncture points, your meridians, etc., are aligned, your kundalini energy is all aligned. There's something both physically, mentally, and spiritually uplifting about sitting straight. And you also kind of find that sweet spot, like if you're not leaning against something, if you're just sitting on a cushion, or if you're not capable of doing that physically sitting on a meditation bench, or if you're not capable of doing that sitting in a chair, but ideally not necessarily leaning against the back. So I try to encourage people to sit straight for that reason. It also has a kind of I don't know, an almost symbolic quality of upliftedness, to be sitting up straight. As my old Buddhist teacher used to say, good head and shoulders. I started formally like a ceremony. After a little bit of explanation, I have a big Tibetan bowl gong thing and strike it 3 times or whatever, and then ask people to just calmly enter in, sit for a minute or two. And then I have already suggested when we're inviting people, I say, if at all possible, Stephen requests that you take a break, or a cannabis fast, I like to call it sometimes, at least 2 or 3 days and preferably longer because of regulation of the endocannabinoid system. It gets full, so to speak. It's more complicated than that scientifically, but basically you need a lot more, and I think it lacks the kind of ethereal or airy kind of open, spacious, almost holy kind of quality if you're smoking all the time, and you come into one of these ceremonies, and especially if you've smoked that day, or if you've been smoking several times a day all week or whatever. So I really strongly encourage people to take a break from it for a while, several days if possible, before they come, so their endocannabinoid systems are reset, they're refreshened as much as possible, right? So then I say, start slow, because 10 minutes from now, I'm going to get your attention again and suggest that if you didn't get as deep as you wanted to, have another toke now and you'll go deeper. But you might want to start with one good-sized Hoover, because we're usually working with cannabis that's 20 to 25% THC. So I suggest like one good Hoover on it. I know it's an old type of vacuum cleaner, the Hoover vacuum. Yeah. And sit in silence with that. And then I'll do a little guided meditation with them or something, like a body scan. I really like body scans. Most of you know about body scans, right? So that you're checking in with your body, because cannabis I think of as an energy medicine that way. It works on the mind, body, spirit level simultaneously, but it has to include the somatic, the body level, right? So you have to tune in, like, what are you doing? Oh, you're holding your shoulder up a little bit, attention in your shoulder. You can let it go, right? So the letting go of the body and the letting go of the mind, or the discursive thinking mind, can happen together simultaneously, right? So then I say, okay, just sit with it, try to let your thoughts go. Don't judge. They come up, so what? Doesn't matter how many you have. Just recognize them, let them go again. Come back to a gentle attention to your breath, not obsessing, not trying to make yoga special breaths, anything like that. Just come back to your breathing, sit on your cushion, and then see where you're at in 5 to 10 minutes. And I'll hit a little ding and say, Okay, now's a good time to have another toke or two if you feel like you didn't go deep enough, right? And then you can still do that. I'll often interrupt them, so to speak, another half hour or 45 minutes later and say, well, maybe we'll have one more now or two more, if you feel like you could go a little deeper. At a certain point, it won't go deeper. It'll just maybe maintain it a little longer because of that endocannabinoid filled up thing, right? And then it's just a mix of, if I had my druthers, in a way, if I really knew the people, all of them, and they were experienced meditators, we wouldn't do much. We'd mostly just sit, which is often what I do at home. I'm always trying to be careful because of that notion that I mentioned earlier, that the busy mind is also the way that we obscure or distract ourselves from the empty state, the opening state, the open state, right? So it's something to pay attention to. Are you tricking yourself? Oh, this is such an exciting thought or thing. I want to follow this, right? You could be doing what the ego has been doing all its life in that sense. So I try to stay with it, and for the most part, and in the circles, I have different instruments. I have crystal bowls. I have little lovely French chimes. I've got a frame drum for the rapid shamanic drumming pattern that you can, like 200 beats a minute or whatever. You can get people into other brain waves. I'll do that occasionally. Once in a while, I'll play some simple stuff on my guitar, but not usually, but then I'll mix that up every time. My view is just keep coming back to the well. So if I do something for 5 minutes, like playing the crystal bowls, I'll always leave 3 or 4 or 5 minutes of just silent sitting in between times, and then another thing. So just coming back to that, and then do that for an hour and a quarter, hour and a half, and then we have a sharing session. Usually have some food after that. If I do an all-day one, it's the same, except that I'll bring an edible, a mild edible in, so that people are up in the state for longer. And frankly, I've also found a small amount of psilocybin mushroom goes really nicely with that. Small, I'm talking like perhaps a quarter of a dried gram in a chocolate or something like that, just a little above microdose level. What that tends to do is it doesn't kind of come in and push the cannabis vibe, so to speak, aside. It just deepens it a little bit more and maybe makes it a little sharper, a little clearer or something like that. But that can work really well. And when I do those all day ones, I won't starve them all day. Although when we're having an edible, we'll do that at the beginning, and I'll ask them not to eat for like 2 hours or so before that. If you're taking ayahuasca or psilocybin or any of these, you usually want to fast for minimum 3, 4, even 6 or more hours, right? When you're taking anything edible, you don't want to have a lot of in your stomach, because it's just going to it's going to both diminish the effect and take a lot longer to kick in, right? So a couple of hours of fasting before, and then a light edible, and then smoking at the same time or a little later, whatever, just mixing it up. Some of it's in my book. And then over the course of the day, we'll do lots of different things, maybe do some yoga too. Sometimes I have a yoga specialist with me in those. And then later on, 3 hours in, I might bring in some cacao or something that's a little bit more of like an energizer, or maybe even a light thing to eat, like some fresh strawberries, but just a little bit, like maybe 2 strawberries, because, if you eat much, it's going to, take that effect away. It's going to bring you back down into the more physical that way. And then just go on like that till 4 or 5 in the afternoon, and then have a potluck and sharing, So that's the simple version of all that.
That was great. And also, if you don't have the book already, chapter 6 lies it out. Like you said, I think it's an open source, flexible. There's a lot of, you could try this or try that, but there are a lot of ideas about building these kinds of ceremonies with people, and they are flexible. It's an exploration, but I do love that you laid that all out in this book.
Great,
so if
yeah.
you don't have it already and you're interested in doing this, I think someone in the chat said that based on this book and a couple of different podcasts, they put together their own ceremony. It's a really great resource for that.
Nice.
All right, Andrew, do you have any?
We only have a couple minutes left, but 2 people at least are very curious if you could comment on kundalini activation and cannabis use.
Well, I don't know that I'm an expert. I'm qualified to answer that question properly. But yeah, because it opens things up potentially, I think that's very possible. that you could have a deeper I mean, people can have kundalini experiences, kundalini openings without any substance, right? So it stands to reason that if you take a substance like cannabis that can potentially open the channels, the physical channels as well as the mental and spiritual channels, then there's absolutely no kind of logical reason why you couldn't have a powerful kundalini experience. But I'm not by any stretch a master of working with kundalini energy, so that's all I'll say about that one.
All right, that's okay. Like I said, we're almost at the end here. So, Corinne, should we promo what's coming? Well, there is no book club coming
There's another
next.
book, but
Small
hang on.
tier.
I have questions for Stephen though, because he just talked
Okay.
about all these amazing things, and we found out before we got on the call that he and I are
Hmm.
virtually neighbors. So I want to know how to
Hmm.
get in a room of 200 people doing these ceremonies. What are the things that people can join you in person, and how can people find you online?
Oh yeah, sure. I'm pretty easy to find. StephenGray, and I'm on Facebook as Stephen Gray. I think it's actually my Facebook group is called Stephen Gray Vision. So, and I don't know why, but I think I mushed the Stephen Gray together, all one word, and then vision as a separate word. So I'm on Facebook that way. My website is also stephengrayvision.com, all together, of course, for a website. And I'm on LinkedIn and Instagram, and once in a while I put something on TikTok. So I'm on yeah, I do all that stuff basically. Also, the 200 people in a room sitting in chairs at our conference, that's not my favorite way to do but because, I can't control it in the same way, right? Like I can't do the have one toke and come back in 10 minutes because it takes, there's logistics to get 200 people out of a room and back in again that are a little too unwieldy for that. So it's not my favorite way, but it actually have heard just stunning, I'm not exaggerating, reports of people saying, my God, I've never known cannabis could do that. And that's a common theme, actually, even in the circles. It's like, if you've never worked with cannabis like that, if you've never sort of, as Terence McKenna might have said, sit down, shut up, and pay attention with this plant, you don't even know how powerful and how strong and how beautiful it can be that way, I think. I think that's true. People are stunned if they have, oftentimes, in a good way, of course, when they have that experience. So that's a conference, by the way, and it's a wonderful conference. It really is. We get a lot of the leaders in the field. We get everybody in the same room so that we actually go through a journey together all weekend here in Vancouver, British Columbia. It's called the Spirit Plant Medicine Conference, spiritplantmedicine.com. And happy to hear from anybody that's watching this, listening to this today or later. If you have a question or just want to engage in dialogue, okay?
Thank you. Yes, people will definitely be reaching out. Corinne's looking up the conference right now. She's
Yeah.
she's booking her train ticket across, or it's wonderful.
I have
All right.
can I just say that I have a much more recent book as well called How Psychedelics Can Help Save the World. It's a similar idea.
Mm.
I gathered together 24 brilliant thought leaders that understand how to wisely, effectively work with psychedelics and their role in for a planet that's in deep doo-doo, frankly.
Well, we definitely need that. Thank you for that. I'm gonna go check it out. Get out.
No, I'm really excited to hear that because I think it's an interesting thing. There's a part of my brain that wanted this book to be cohesive and that wants books to be like one person's perspective, learning all the things and then digesting it from my brain. But there is something that's really incredible about compiling all of these different ideas and different perspectives on the plant that makes it possible for you to navigate it for yourself. Like you can't just follow down somebody else's path. And I think that's really cool doing that with cannabis and also doing that with psychedelics, because there are so many books that are coming out now that are very much like one person's perspective and how they feel that psychedelics should be used or how they should be reintroduced into the population. So I think it's really a great idea to include many voices when you're covering topics that have a lot of different perspectives. These
Mhm.
are dynamic plant medicines. I really appreciate that that way of approaching it, even though part of me is like, no, just tell me, give it to me straight, Stephen. Just give me the pathway there. Tell me what to do.
If only one of our experts had the pathway, right? That'd be great.
That has been us all book club season. We're like, can't you just tell us the answers?
Yeah, well, that's the thing. The answer is within you, right?
I hate small talk so much.
Oh my gosh, me too. I didn't know that about you.
Oh, good. Barf.
I grew up in Ontario, but I had the wisdom to leave there in my early 20s.
Hey, Andrew, where are you at?
Ontario.
No wisdom.
We'll probably talk about it in there, but are you on new? No, don't tell us because I want to be surprised.
Okay.
It's an Andrea classic. Stop herself in the middle of a question.
God tilted the continent to the west and all the nuts rolled to the west coast. So that was me. That was one of those.
My nut also rolled this way until it ran into the ocean.